I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. The news came on June 7th. A half-naked blade soldier came running through Seoul's South Gate. General Sinup's army has been destroyed, the man said, as he was one of his soldiers and one of the few to escape. His message was one of terror. Run for your lives. Panic shot through the city all throughout the day. The people grabbed their possessions and pressed through the gates. There was no planned secondary safe space, and they simply went in all directions in search of safety. When sunset came, the gates normally were locked, but not this time. The guards had fled and left the gates open. Night fell, but the great bell didn't sound the end of the day. The ringer, too, had fled. That same evening, an emotional meeting between King Seonjo and a number of his top ministers were held at the Gyeongbok Palace to decide what to do. Most of the officials wanted to remain in Seoul. They reasoned that the royal tombs and the king's ancestors' works were there, and they should stay and hold out until aid arrived. Prime Minister Sanhai pointed out that there were precedents for the king to evacuate if there was a threat, but he was silenced by the others in the meeting. They even went as far as to ask the king to dismiss the man for having made the suggestion. King Seonjo was not quite foolish enough, though. There was only 7,000 soldiers to defend the 27 kilometers of walls around the city. He knew that they just wouldn't be able to defend the city with those kind of numbers. And he made the painful decision to evacuate the capital and move north to the walled city of Pyongyang. It was also decided at the time to answer the question of royal succession. See, over the past year, the courts of Seoul were in upheaval over who to pick for King Seonjo's successor, the temperamental 18-year-old Imjin or the upstanding 17-year-old Kwang Hae. On June 8th, with no time left to debate the issue, they chose Kwang Hae to be installed as crown prince. Throughout the night between the 8th and the 9th, preparations were made by the royal household for evacuation. Piles of straw sandals were collected, horses saddled, and the king's ancestral tablets packed and shipped north. But that was it. Old books, paintings, gold, government documents, even food was left behind. The sun was just starting to rise when the king and the new crown prince mounted their horses and led the rest of the family, the courtiers, and government officials out of the capital's gates towards the Imjin River and to the safety of the north. Princes Imjin and the younger Sunhwa set out with a group on their own. They were headed to the northeastern province of Hamgyong, where they hoped to get the local people to resist the Japanese. The citizens of Seoul were worked up into an even bigger panic, and shouts of anger were thrown both at the king and his officials. I mean, they were abandoning the capital, and all hope was truly lost for them. Seoul was an anarchy. The citizens were frantically fleeing for their lives, taking anything of value with them. And then the fires started. Angry mobs of people formed up and tore torched the palaces and then the royal granary. Every government building that they could get their hands on was also set on fire. And family grudges were being settled out in the streets. And vendors were being robbed. The capital was completely consumed by chaos. All of this was going on. The king and his entourage was on the road at a blistering pace. They were terrified that the Japanese were right behind them. Anything, and really anyone that was slowing them down, was abandoned on the road. And meals were made in haste. They didn't even stop when it started to rain, and they wallowed through the mud in soaked silk gowns. When they finally made their way to the Imjin River, only half of the group was actually able to fit on the small ferry, and the rest were simply left behind. Midstream, the king finally broke down. The sight was so unsettling that everyone present was also reduced to tears as well. When they finally reached the other side of the bank, they sunk the ferry in the hopes that it would slow down any potential pursuers. When they finally got their way to the Tongpa way station, there was not enough food for everyone, and even the king went to bed that night hungry. The next day, the governor of Hwanghae arrived with several hundred soldiers to escort them to the next station and to have their first proper meal in 2 days. And then they pushed on to Kaesong and rested inside the walls for a day before pushing back on the road to Pyongyang. And this is where I would like to leave off for this episode. And so far, we've covered incredible things in this war. I'll remind you of everything that has happened in this war since the first landing at Busan. This has only taken a couple of weeks. Old tactics have fallen to new tactics. And just think, the Japanese actually gave the Koreans the very guns that they were now using to defeat them. And it's so strange that these weapons didn't impress them or even give them cause for alarm. And what of the sinking of their own ships? It is pretty incredible that so many were sunk by the Koreans' own hands. So many mistakes made. But that's war. And it's easy to see mistakes here and now, but back then, I imagine it wasn't so easy. Tune in next time as the Japanese reach the capital. Who will reach it first, Kato or Konishi? We'll cover the answer to this and more in the next episode of Japan at War. See you then.